Turmoil, Elysium, an audiobook narrated by Ciel Liddell. Chapter 1 Delirium. One beautiful afternoon, a boy named Ashton was awakened by his father. Preparations for his wedding would soon begin that same day. Ashton would be united in life with the son of the Winstors, to which Ashton felt too excited about this. He loved that man with all of his heart. When he saw himself in the mirror with that white suit, one that signified purity, combined with his platinum hair and those blue eyes that captured anyone, he had the feeling that everything would take a 180-degree turn that afternoon. Ashton was approaching the altar with his dreams and hopes up in the sky. He would give his hand to Marcus Windsor. When he kissed Marcus, he would feel 1,000 butterflies on his stomach. They would leave the church holding hands with great happiness. Ashton would say goodbye to his parents and get into the carriage in which they would go to the honeymoon. Ashton would wave his hands while his parents cried, although they did not seem to cry because of happiness. The road to the honeymoon was strange. Marcus didn't say a word and just looked at the window impatiently, while Ashton thought about everything he would do now as a married person. Although, for him this whole ceremony had been weird. There wasn't even a normal banquet, just the silence that lasted the whole dinner. Ashton didn't know if it was a celebration or a funeral. He did not give it importance. Upon arriving at the Windsor's holiday palace, Marcus would get out of the car first and tell Ashton to wait there for a moment. There was something wrong in there, a bad feeling. Ashton would get out of the car and approach the palace doors, which were open because Marcus had entered first. When entering the palace, a strange smell greeted him, something that seemed to be a gas that made anyone lose consciousness. Ashton would wake up in the middle of an operation in which they would do nothing more than twist and stretch the parts of his body, cutting with precision. The surgeons installed a type of chip in his body, one which was connected to his brain functions. It was supposed that this would make him forget all of his memories like a human. But he didn't. The surgeons gave up, and so they started the Turmoil program by connecting him to a machine that would plunge him into a deep sleep and take him to that virtual reality directly from his chest, as if they had performed an open heart surgery to install a new one. Ash woke up dizzy in the middle of a storm wherever he was. It seemed to be the center of a desolate city full of cobwebs and a lot of wind. His joints ached, and his mind seemed to be on a constant static. He would crawl through the streets of whatever it seemed to be a city consumed by time. Plants grew on the abandoned buildings, and gloom full of loneliness invaded the sky. His memories were strange. He managed to remember Marcus. His face looked strange, distorted. His memories were like an old cassette player. They were distorted all the time, and it was really difficult to remember everything that had happened. Although there was something he did remember, those nights when, after having moved in with Marcus, he had begun to be very quiet and reserved. He would invite his friends to the house and have chats, but those people did not look friendly. Marcus always told him to go back to the bedroom and wait for him to go to sleep, and Ashton obeyed because he wanted to be a good couple, but there was something that did not add up: their talks. In moments of curiosity, Ashton would sneak through the halls of his own house to listen to these talks, chats and chatter at 2 in the morning. Even though it did not sound like a normal chatter of every day, Marcus' friends said that he was not the right one for the experiment, and that it was better to get rid of him. Marcus protested. He was the perfect one, and that everything would work out in his favor. But what did he meant? Ash arrived at the house trying to find something to eat. It was raining outside and it was already getting dark. Although it seemed to be a totally abandoned house, the electricity was working fortunately. Ash looked at himself in the mirror, still trying to remember what had happened. But he didn't remember anything. His body looked strange. It seemed as his limbs had been cut and sewn up. Ash would touch one of the suitors and would feel a sharp pain. He decided to not touch it again, and better leave things like that. There are things that should not be investigated. He decided to rest a little. He covered himself in a blanket and tried to sleep in one of the rooms, a somewhat messy one in which there was a television. He took the control to play and turned it on. As soon as the TV picked up, a video began to play, one in which there were strange symbols, strange images, and strange symbolism. At the end, an informative cut would begin, by which the inhabitants of that dystopian land were recommended to stay at home, because there was a virus that was taking several on its path. Following this, the TV would return to static, and any signal that there was went out. Ash curled up and decided better to sleep, hoping that this would wake him up from his nightmare. That night would have been strange and terrifying. Ash would wake up in the middle of the night to see a figure stuck in the ceiling, one that seemed to open its mouth and had no eyes. From its mouth emerged a flower which was on fire. It began to slowly descend into the direction of Ash's mouth. Several hands emerged from under the bed to hold Ash and make him stay still, even holding the corners of his mouth to keep it open. He felt as if his skin was being burned, and then that flower would enter Ash's mouth, forcing him to swallow that burning flower. Ash would feel the heat going down of his throat and tears would fall from his eyes. But that thing that was on the ceiling would begin to complain. Those arms would begin to break and crumble, little by little, one by one. That goal was complaining. It was very loud. Ash, who no longer would react by himself, he reacted in a very impulsive way. He took the tongue of the creature and would manage to get it out of his own mouth. Even though he would not manage to get the flower out, he swallowed it and felt how that heat, burned as hell, descended of his stomach. Ash would abruptly pull that thing down, and between hallucinations, he would put his hand on the chest of that creature just to remove his heart. That creature would begin to change shapes non-stop, until it became a ball of matter with needles that stuck on the boy's body. Those needles would begin to inject something inside the boy. Between convulsions and the feeling of seeing his whole life pass through his eyes in a total of 7 minutes, he felt how all that evil and terror entered himself. Those suitors in his skin that he had such a few moments before would begin to get replaced with small flowers, of which the roots were digging into the holes, and the suitors went as if they were replacing those strands. Ash would get out of the bed and crawl towards the mirror. He looked different. His hair went from being platinum gray to a black with light red stripes. Around his body there were veins that looked like roots that had a strange type of thorns. On his face there were small chamomile flowers growing. Ash would manage to reach to the lock of the front door and open the door. He would look around. The storm had broken out again. Ash fell weakly to the ground, hearing how a car was coming in the background. They carried him in their arms and lifted him on a stretcher, and finally Ash fainted. Chapter 2: Destruction. Ash would wake up being taken on a stretcher by what seemed to be doctors or specialists. His head was spinning again, and the urge to vomit was uncontrollable. He felt sick and in need of help. The doctors would take him into a large confinement room with a giant screen in front of him. They set him down and gagged him with a metal chair, so that he would not move or utter a single word. They left him alone for a few minutes to observe his behavior in a lonely environment with the security cameras. After a few moments, the scientist, Alistair, would arrive. Behind him, even more scientists would arrive and start talking. We needed a survivor of the storms and bombings to serve us, someone who would be useful. someone who would deceive people with his appearance and achieve our goal. As Alistair began to speak, the other scientists, including Tunim and Owen and Hardy, would begin to analyze him, examining his sutures, the growing flowers on his body, and every possible detail. We don't mind experiments on humans on here. We're not in the real world. This is a simulation, one that got out of control, Alistair said. On the giant screen they would show videos of inhuman things that they had done. They had captured women to force them to be incubators. Children were kidnapped from their mothers to be used as scapegoats, test subjects. They had created a system, but for what purpose? We created a city with all of this. A city full of luxury, opulence, money, and everything that is not outside. But it is unbalanced. People are becoming perverse. They are committing crimes with the excuse that there is no God in here, and we need a novice in this world to balance it. Someone they had never seen in their lives. We can play God, create a deity for them, make them believe that they are safe. Ash asked himself, but what is so special about me? Alistair commented, the only thing you'll have to do is obey our orders and keep yourself under strict treatment. We see that what is inside of you is not finished. Your insides are a mess. So we will finish the work of those who brought you here and make you a divine creation. Ash tried to refuse. He moved from his chair, trying to get out of those metal traps that were hurting his arms and legs. He couldn't speak. He was completely gagged, but he tried to shake his head. Alistair looked at him with contempt. So you don't want to? You put your morals over a lot of power? This is not the real world, but there's something that is. On the screen, images began to be projected, images that Ash wishes he had never seen, videos of his parents, videos that were captured on the distance. Do these bastards have a presence on the real world as well? Well, you can't refuse, but if you do, they will die on a horrendous way. Marcus will let us do it. We know you are coming from him. How did they know Marcus' name? Ash had no idea. Even so, Ash was still shaking with his head, trying to still get off. The metal edges were beginning to hurt his arms and legs. Alistair let a sigh of disappointment and gave a snap. In a few seconds, an electric burst would envelope Ash's body, electrocuting every part of his body, letting out a moan of muffled pain. Ash, in his despair, would end up accepting his defeat, and as soon as they turned off that mechanism, Alistair would end up removing the gag from his mouth, and Ash would begin to beg that man to please not hurt his parents and to leave them out of this. Alistair grabbed Ash by the chin to admire his beauty for a few moments and would wave the signal for him to be taken to the operation room. In less than a few minutes, he was registered in the system as a human-cyborg hybrid. One by one, they refined the creation that had been thought to be lost at first. The doctors found a flaw in his brain, his memories. They were not oppressed. They were not forgotten either. It was impossible to do an operation like this. In Turmoil, you must not remember what you were before you were in there. Maybe within the game you can access to a few of your memories, but you can't be the same as it was on land. They would end up using a large dose of painkillers to suppress them, and once for all. Maybe they would be forgotten, but it would be more difficult for them to return to Ash's brain. Empyrean Apparatus was finishing the creation of one of his most ambitious experiments, a crude and mundane attempt to recreate what was once sacred into a sacrilege. But what was Empyrean Apparatus? An organization in the world of Turmoil, For several years, several men and women formed a commune that would end up becoming the city of Ataraxia, at first led by the need of being able to live in peace in a world in which only chaos reigned. They would end up succumbing to become a hostile organization which continued to cooperate out of the desire to play God, and the inhabitants of Ataraxia were but test subjects, sheep of a cattle. Elysium Corporation knew nothing about this, or so they believed. They had kept this secret very well guarded for a long time. When he woke up, Ash was in a car being taken to the city of Ataraxia. His clothing were now different. He was dressed in a strange way, an outfit reminiscent of the Renaissance era, black and red. When he saw himself in the car rear view mirror, he looked different. He looked like someone else. When they arrived at the city, the security guards lined up to show the way to the car, raising their machine guns to indicate that this was on the part of what seemed to be the government. They went through a long tunnel, which seemed to not end until they reached the entrance of Ataraxia, and all the color that was missing outside. Ash would take a walk through those streets. They were different from what he had already seen. His mouth was dry and the words didn't come out. The people walking around him seemed to be people of money, in areas built up with stolen money. Fountains were everywhere. People wore cute suits and hats, canes. They walk and talk in arrogant ways, shouting to the world that they had money. Ash saw himself in the puddles of the water in the city. He couldn't see himself. He saw a strange shell on his wrist. The roots of a flower began to spread little by little like veins. Those who had been pulled out of the night before began to leave holes on his skin. Owen would take Ash to the apartment that had been bought for him, although Ash still didn't understand what they wanted. When he asked Owen, Owen would tell him that they wanted to make him feel important, an important person to others. Rather, that's something that is only used as an experiment. While Ash was washing his face in the bathroom of the apartment, the mirror would suddenly break, making a cut on Ash's arm, which would begin to bleed that black and thick substance. From this substance, a few lily flowers would begin to bloom, which quickly settled up on the arm and stopped the bleeding. Owen, on the other side of the room, received a call from Iberian Apparatus, congratulating him for his great work, and warning him that the next day they would have more work to do, although Owen would end the call to prepare the package of sedatives. Iberian Apparatus had sent them to him. You must inject them every 6 hours. If an emergency occurs, do it in a less like those. Chapter 3. The Doll. The next morning, Owen would find a mirror broken in the bathroom and Ash in the bathtub asleep. He would quickly wake him up to prepare him, undress him, and bath him. When he was finished, he would drag him into the living room to dress him up, choosing a red suit with tight white pants, combining it with a ponytail. Ash would regain consciousness the moment he was already dressed up. Owen and Ash would leave the apartment and walk to the streets of Ataraxia. As he passed near a fountain, Ash would regain a memory, a fixed one. One of the nights, Marcus had told him that he wanted to go home after they had a really big fight, to which Marcus would have told him that he was going to lie down. But at midnight, Ash would hear Marcus leave the house. When he arrived at the central market, several men would offer fruit and vegetables to the boy. Owen would ask him to not accept any fruit or anything. His body was not ready to eat yet. Anything he put on his stomach would stay there until it burst. A man offered him a rose, into which he had dropped a drop of blood, trying to impress Ash. Owen would stand in front of them both and throw the rose and then step on it. From that rose, 1,000 spiders scattered around and walked in circles towards Ash. He was unfazed. when he felt how one of those many spiders entered one of the holes that had been left by the flowers plucked on his skin, Owen would not react. He only took Ash's wrist, took out a syringe and applied sedatives. The spiders came out terrified from the wound, and even though it did not close, it was clean. People watched Ash and Owen curiously. They seemed intrigued and excited about whatever that boy with flowers around his body was. Owen presented him as a boy of good money, directly backed by Elysium. Soon more people began to gather around as if it was some kind of great event. Ash was described as a being who would do whatever you want, a very tame pet. For a boy that grew up having money, he's very obedient and kind, said several elderly people. Some looked at him with desire and others with lust. Meanwhile, Ash really didn't quite understand. Maybe it was because of the sedatives that had been injected that same morning to appear publicly. He had lost himself a little in between what they were supposed to try to do with him. He did everything people told him. A rumor began to spread through the streets of the city, one which said to ask him 3 wishes, and that's what people did. His suit managed to cover a large part of the roots that grew like veins through his arms, along with the white gloves, so people didn't notice this when they saw him. A man approached him to offer him a ring. Some children left flowers for him. It was a very tiring afternoon for the boy, a sensation that went around the entire city. Later, Ash sat on a bench watching the dusk. In the distance, in distant cities, bombs were exploding. They seemed to be refugees from the other cities who were killed as soon as they tried to reach Ataraxia. Perhaps they did not have the money or the power, or because they were not experiments or specimens of the government. Owen sat down next to him. They can't get here. They need to have the money or the power that you have. Power that we're giving you. If it weren't for us, you'd be out with the death, he said passive-aggressively, while Owen took his hand and injected a little bit more of sedatives on his wrist. Ash asked curiously about the sedatives, and Owen only replied that he had to be manageable at all times, so he would have to get used to a daily injection every 6 hours. By night, word had spread on the news in the city of Ataraxia. The reporter was talking about how someone had arrived at the city and the stir it had caused. His photos were shown on TV. Soon everyone wanted to know what he was preaching. Ash was seeing himself on the TV, sitting in the armchair of the apartment while Hardy extracted that black matter from his body. They would have managed to schedule a presentation for him and the local leader. Owen entered the room, turned off the TV and took Ash straight to sleep. But Ash would spend the whole night awake. Ash was in the dressing room, Owen combing his hair and choosing his wardrobe for the presentation, a black suit with red borders and too many ruffles, his hair combed with braids and pale makeup, so Ash could perfectly go on stage, not before receiving an injection of the sedatives. Only then he would go on stage on his own, one in total silence. The people watched judgingly. Ash would introduce himself as their leader. With previously programmed words, he gave a speech about how he would be the one to save Elysium and start with Ataraxia, eradicating the things that were not going to be necessary, and how Ash deserved to reach the high commands. The people were not impressed. They had heard the same speech many times, and Ash, desperate because of the silence, he would fold the sleeves of his suit and make a cut on his own finger and wrist, dropping his dark blood on the ground while saying that this would be the divine offering to the citizens to trust him. The people began to scream in euphoria. Those who were in the front row of the theater reached a little bit of the blood with their fingertips, and when they tasted, they would be ecstatic. If that divine offering was all they needed to believe in that boy, then they wanted more. The people began to push each other to get in the front row and try a taste of at least a little bit of the delicacy. Ash left the stage dizzy. Although he couldn't say it aloud, he was afraid of what he had just done. Empty promises to inhabitants of a place he didn't know. Now that the boy was considered an exemplary citizen and the possible new leader of Ataraxia, it was time for the phase 2 of the plan, to make him that leader that the people wanted. That same night, they would receive an invitation to a ball, the Lion Court Ball. The people who controlled the city and also the people who were somehow kind of like presidents. They wanted to meet the young man who had arrived and who said he wanted to be a leader for everyone. They said his flesh was appetizing, his face was like a face of a fallen angel, his body wasn't spectacular. They wanted to taste him, have him, and impact him. Chapter 4 Goth Complex. One stormy night in the high mountains of the city, they arrived at the Lion Court house. Ash looked outside of the walls of Ataraxia and saw how the tornadoes destroyed everything in their path. The lighting illuminated those distant lands. Owen would open the door of the car and give Ash his hand to enter the Lion Court mansion. The man would tie Ash to a monolith in the middle of the great hall, appreciating him with hunger. A voracious hunger. Several would approach him, leaving some coins and wads of money. These men appeared to be normal on the outside, but the moment they saw such young and beautiful prey, they would throw themselves at them like hungry wolves to a sheep. They connected intravenous tubes to his wrist to extract his blood and put it on small wine glasses, so everyone could enjoy the delicacy that had driven the audience crazy at the theater. In short, his blood was infinite. Being half robot, he regenerated as quickly as possible and could fill entire gallons of matter. When they finished feeding everyone, Isabella Lioncourt and Harold Lioncourt would start a family auction for the boy. The one who would pay the most for him would take him to make him worthy of being one of the leaders of the city. Being the one who would give the most money, a man named Paul, a tall man that doubles Ash's age, but at least well preserved and cute apparently. He was very attractive. Paul took him tied around the neck with a leash. Both would take a room and undress to continue the act, promising him that after this, his life would be changed forever. In the middle of a kiss, Ash would feel the urge to vomit. He felt that something was coming from the inside, something horrendous and frightening. He let the thick black liquid inside of Paul's mouth, who would drown in this liquid until he was finished swallowing it. At contrary to what anyone would think, Paul would ask him to continue, and so it would be. Ash felt great strangeness. This didn't feel like the same as he did with Marcus. It felt strange. But those doubts ceased the moment Paul began to have convulsions. Ash took the opportunity to take his clothes and leave there as quickly as possible. When he arrived at the room, a large majority of the attendees were on the floor for what seemed to be Caesars, similar to the ones Paul had just a few minutes ago. Ash looked for the exit, but his eyes began to distort, as if something was telling him that he had achieved the goal. Owen followed him strangely and injected the sedatives into his arm. That distortion in Ash's eyes went away. Something was wrong, and they were about to realize what they had caused. They fled in the car while the rain became heavier. Owen would ask, "What happened?" and Ashton would not answer. He would just ask to get home as quickly as possible. On the TV, the news would appear that Paul Lyncourt, the eldest son of the Lyncourts, had fallen in with a strange disease that was currently on a stretcher. The relatives said that their son was beginning to see hallucinations, that there was something that managed to calm his hallucinations. Ash's dark blood, the same that everyone had drunk at that dinner. If Paul didn't drink it, he would start to be terrified of a clone of himself on the ceiling. Didn't that sound similar? In the following days, hell broke loose in that peaceful city. People began to get sick and no one knew what was happening. Had they not done everything possible to eradicate the disease of the Duke? If they even had banned foreign videotapes to prevent the video that caused this disease from reaching the city, the Lion Courts had announced a curfew and a total closure in the city, since more family members and even the domestic worker had fallen ill, and they were trying to not spread the disease to the entire city, if necessary, that it only spread it inside of the high commands. In short, they had the money and the power to save themselves. For his part, Ash looked at himself in the mirror while Owen brushed his hair. The roots of the flowers had grown even more in his arms, and from one side of his face, little lilies began to emerge. He could still see, but there was discomfort coming from inside of his eye socket. Owen would prepare him to sleep. Hardy would enter the room minutes later. He needed to extract a little bit more liquid. Apparently, due to the havoc that the disease was causing in the Lion Court family, the only thing that saved them was that dose of the dark blood. He brought all the necessary tubes and they began to extract a generous amount of black liquid. As soon as they left Ash alone, he would wake up and somewhat dizzy with the desire to vomit. He would arrive staggering to the bathroom, and behind him in the broken mirror, he would see himself before his transformation, screaming at him with a face broken into 1,000 pieces while spiders began to come out of his eye socket. That version would drag him across the floor of the apartment and pull him by his hair. That Ash would yell at the other one to give him back what was his, but the other Ash didn't have an answer, just silence. That Ash would take the old Ash's hand and twist it only to rip it off his arm, letting thousands of spiders out of there. That version of Ash's body would quickly disintegrate into the ground, just leaving a key there, one with the note, "You will need me." Chapter 5. The Plague. The disease had managed to spread over the narrowest corners of Ataraxia. People were becoming insane by drinking that blood, that sacred chalice that brought you back to life. They had to drink it directly from the womb to continue living. This is how the specialists would manage to reach the phase 2 of their plan and manage to control the citizens of Ataraxia to their liking. Ash perched on a monolith on the center of the city with tubes stuck in his arms and legs, which carried Ash's blood for the others. Everyone drank it as if it was some type of delicacy, causing furor in the distant far lands, since this was the one wanted. How could it be that instead of arresting him, they were venerating him as a deity? Owen looked at him in the distance while taking notes and giving suggestions, such as never letting Ash's womb be uncovered, since if they were uncovered, flowers would grow from there and it would be impossible to continue with everything. Every 6 hours he approached to give him his daily dose of sedatives, so Ash remained inside of the roll without asking questions. Ash felt how the roots of the flowers had grew around his body, and most of them went to the chest, forming a heart. His right eye had also fallen off, and from there several tulips and roses began to bloom. People piled up for a little bit of blood and to see the aforementioned one. It was like seeing a living god in the middle of the city. At night, when he got home, Ash would feel too tired and would decide to go to sleep as quickly as possible. Owen would apply his dose of sedatives before going to sleep and put him to bed peacefully, so he would stay on his bedside watching him sleep as the world faded away for Ash. But it was not until a few hours he would wake up. Neither Owen nor Hardy were in the apartment, and someone was knocking the door. Ash would open the door only to be greeted by a person putting a cloth with chloroform to inhale. Ash would faint, and he could only remember fragments of the moment he was inside a car. one that was taking him far away from anorexia as possible. Ash would regain consciousness in a guarded white room. He had been captured by Marcus guards, who would have connected him to a stretcher surrounded by tubes on which Ash was perched crucified. They would not waste time trying to analyze the error that was on his system. Marcus would enter the room only to observe his work of chaos. Apparently, the virus had stalled itself too much in his system, and now it was impossible to install it from Ash. They would try the purification more than once, each time ending with more flowers growing around Ash's body, who began to look like somewhat grotesque, and slowly began to get fed up with whatever they were doing to him. An uncontrollable urge to vomit would return to Ash's body, as if he were asking him to please. And so Ash would release that viscous substance again, a substance that when it came out of his mouth and pores would end up contaminating the tubes and melting them, freeing him from that experimentation. Ash would approach the glass to break it by hitting it with his forehead, and would start running so that they would not reach him, hiding in one of the quietest rooms that there were. When the light came on, Ash would see some plants on the walls, and when he read that more carefully, he would notice several notes calling it an experiment. But that was not the worst that he had found. Ash would find a book in which there were more experiments, even noteth. He was not the only one. Half of the inhabitants of that world were taken by recruiters like Marcus, sick people who sought pleasure seeing people suffer for their lives in alternative realities. Ash had decided to end this, searching among all of this encyclopedia if there was any way to finish the game and get out of alive somehow. Ash left that room looking around and tried to run aimlessly. One by one, his thoughts and memories returned to him. His mind began to distort between his past and his new memories. Meanwhile, Empyrean apparatus forced their way into that underground base, asking to see the experiment, killing several people on their path. Ash felt himself begin to spontaneous combustion and still ran with everything he could. That was until he directly encountered Marcus on the run. But Ash was no longer the same that he was several days ago. They both looked at each other with contempt. Marcus couldn't believe what his most ambitious creation had become. His eyes emanated a terrifying aura of danger. Ash's mind blurred for a moment. His arm would move on its own accord, and he would grab Marcus' wrist dislocated. Marcus would let out a horrendous scream. Ash's limbs would begin to fray in a somewhat grotesque way. Those suitors made of flowers would begin to stretch to twist Marcus' body even more. Who would only ask for mercy. Ash did not know what he was doing. One part of his mind told him to stop, and the other one told him to continue, to make his end more painful, to finish with everything that Marcus had started. Alarms began to ring around the corridors, and the shirt of Marcus was wearing would begin to tear little by little, exposing a lock on Marcus' chest. Ash would put the key that he had taken a few days ago, and the lock would open, exposing a letter in which he apologized for his actions, in which at the end he expressed that his world deserves a happy ending. Behind the letter, the map of that underground base was drawn with a pen, being 9 circles that he would have to go down to reach the last circle in which the self-destruct button of that world was. Ash would tear off Marcus' hand just in case he needed the footprints to be able to open the doors that needed the fingerprint, and so he would begin his search for the way down of the circles. Chapter 6. Welcome to Hell. Ash would go down the 9 levels of the underground bunker of Elysium Corporation with ease. When he reached the first level, he would visualize cages with women and children bringing their arms through their bars, trying to reach the boy. Each one of them screamed for mercy and help. When he reached the second level, Ash found a dantesque scenario. People being forced to have sex, and being contained in cages with scientists. Likewise, several of the specialists carried strollers with what appeared to be babies. In one of the rooms, there were several women locked in front of a glass door. They all gathered together trying to break the door. The doctors lifted the babies in front of the door to see them among the mockery of the doctors. Seeing how the boy walked among them, the doctors would try to stop Ash, but Ash's limbs would go through the stomach of every single one of the doctors, one by one, not being able to stop him. They would accidentally end up opening the glass doors where those women were contained. Full of rage, they would jump furiously on the still living bodies of the scientists and begin to bite and scratch, tearing the limbs of the scientists, making this a grotesque scenario. Those who were forced into the confinement chambers would react to the lack of sedatives by murdering those who were providing the fluids to create the babies. That baby they had picked up in their arms would be taken by the woman and guarded together with care and affection. "Nothing will happen to you, dear," they said with the tone that only a mother could express to their child. When he reached the third level of the bunker, he would find a hostile habitat. At the back, there were stretchers with even more experiments connected to the stomach inflated with food as if they were balloons. Others becoming skinny to the bone. On large screens, images of what should be the adequate diet for the experiments were projected, including the babies they brought from the previous level, which were in specialized chambers because of how small they were. They could not be in such hostile environment as the others. It seems that they experimented with them with the amount of foods that they needed. They did not notice Ash walking among them. They were very busy with their own thing. On the fourth level of the bunker, they experimented with the cyborgs and how much weight they could carry. Most of them were all cyborgs of the male gender. Some were crushed by so much weight that they tried to carry, quickly becoming a grotesque scenario due to the mixture of oil, blood, and guts that was scattered around. One of the doctors would notice Ash and try to get him, but he would end up slipping one of the wires in the floor, one that would go up to the floor due to one of the mechanisms choking him right there. The scientist would run to that scientist who was drowning, distracting them from Ash, who was approaching the entrance of the fifth level. The fifth level seemed to be a kind of dumpster. All the cyborgs of all kinds and genres were there. The ones who didn't work, they were behind bars trying to move between glitches and convulsions. Ash would press the button to free them all. Each one of them would come out of their cages and go directly to the levels above. Moving like spiders, when they reached the levels 4 and 3, they would kill the scientists who were in those levels. For a reason, they were contained in rooms like this. The sixth level was the level in which they examined what the cult of Ash was, the cult that was being formed in Ataraxia. Apparently, they didn't know about all of this, and they were watching them. On the screens, you could see a whole investigation about this religion, this cult, and how the city began to decay due to the need of Ash's blood. As soon as Ash passed through the door to go to the 7th level, one of the cyborgs of the 5th level entered, and without waiting, he would jump on one of the scientists to tear him apart. In a few seconds, the others would press the emergency buttons, but the cyborgs didn't take time. As they would go one by one, they had no weapons. They thought they wouldn't need them someday. They only thought everything was so well contained that it was useless. On the 7th level, the cyborgs who disobeyed the corporation and tried to wake up there were punished in atrocious ways. Some were tied up and forced to swallow lava. Others had their tongues cut out and welded again. Others were whipped on the back until they were destroyed and rebuilt. Ash would take advantage of the fact that everyone was so busy between their tortures and cut the tube that injected the sedatives into the punished ones. He would press the button that kept everyone gagged and trapped. each one of them returning to a state in which consciousness. They would begin to bite and scratch their executioners. They had so much contained rage at being punished without being able to say anything that they were blinded by anger, murdering their captors in horrendous ways. The penultimate level was empty. They were empty rooms divided by 10 corridors in a place in which there was an elevator which could take you to any level that you wanted. It seemed that this was the place where the scientists and the doctors of Elysium Corporation who controlled Turmoil from the inside lived. The elevators seemed to be occupied. Someone seemed to be going down, so Ash would destroy the elevator room so that no one would get out, and thus he would reach the last level. Elysium Corporation was behind the control of all of this. In turn, something dark was taking over the corporation. The employees began to throw themselves to the ground while flowers grew under their bodies. Some fell down in death, and others protested. But something was for sure. It was spreading. So while in the upper levels, Empyrean apparatus was still looking for Ash. How could it be that they had lost their source of power in just one day of just having made him the leader of Ataraxia? People were dying. They were eating themselves for a bit of pleasure. When he reached the last level, Ash walked towards the door. It was an even narrower level than the previous levels, and using the hand that he had snatched from Marcus, he entered that narrow corridor. Behind Ash, something called him. He recognized that voice. It was Owen. Ashton turned to see Owen with that notebook, watching him in the shadows. Owen would approach him little by little to tell him that they had to go back to the outside at once. Ash told him to step aside, and Owen didn't move. He moved closer just to grab something that he had on his neck, taking off some kind of mask that he had worn for several days now. He would throw it to the floor. Marcus was the one behind that mask. Ash would fall to the floor of the print while thinking, "Didn't I just kill him?" While Marcus laughed, the corridor seemed to become narrower and even more fearsome. Marcus would remind Ash that he was his experiment, and that now that it got out of control, he had the option to voluntarily surrender and become the example of why rebelling against this dystopia ended in death, and why the only people they should follow were the leaders and not the strangers with money who appeared from one day to another, where he would have to do it by force. Ash tried to stab him, but it was useless. Marcus tried to pull Ash by his hair, but he would bite his arm, the arm that had fed him for so long. He would manage to run through the corridor, a dark corridor that seemed to darken, a corridor in which there were only 2 doors. At the same time, his wounds began to open, letting out the black and viscous liquid. He was already used to this. The liquid would end up becoming a net that would cover the corridor completely. Ash would find out that he needed the fingerprints to enter. Chapter 7. The Abyss. Inside that room there was a button in the back, one in which there were written the words Turmoil, Self-Destruction, with a warning that anyone who pressed that button would end causing the end of the game, and all the players would die with no way to avoid it. Without thinking, Ash would press the button. On the surface, bombs began to fall on the desert landscape. In the city of Ataraxia, in the distant cities, everything began to be destroyed, no matter what. Marcus would manage to enter halfway through the net. His body, made of metal and human skin, would be able to withstand the acid that burned his skin, but he had become stuck because of the net contracting as if it had life on its own. His eyes and arms began to grow, and his arms grabbed Marcus by the legs so he could not escape. Ash would leave the first room and go to the next one. Flowers began to grow non-stop down on his body, and now the only thing he could do was crawl through the corridors. In that corridor, the only thing he would find would be a giant pit, a bottomless one, an abyss. Marcus would manage to free himself and enter the room. Ash was on the edge of the abyss. He would try to talk to him. Do you remember all of this? We can do better if you join us, Marcus told Ash, but Ash couldn't take it anymore physically. His arms began to fray and detach from his body. His legs began to lose balance and his eyes seemed dead. They no longer had the light that he once had. Ash didn't say a word, and his body fell to pieces inside the abyss. He was still aware of everything, so a tear fell down his face, and finally everything was over. One by one, this world began to be destroyed. The underground bunker of Elysium Corporation would explode, leaving thousands of bodies buried in the underground. On the surface, ataraxia began to die. The streets exploded. The inhabitants crawled for food on the streets. They had not eaten that similar delicacy that they had tasted days before. A bomb quickly fell on ataraxia, ending the suffering of the inhabitants of that city. Quickly, the creators of Turmoil would try to do anything to save their experiment, but they would achieve nothing. Who knows how long it would take them to rebuild that alternative and dystopian world that they had spent years creating. Perhaps it was finally the end of a cycle. Prologue. Ash no longer woke up from that fever dream. As soon as the computer shut down, his interior imploded, leaving a mess in the test room. Most of the Turmoil players had died, including Marcus, the person who had led Ash to his death. Suddenly, Alastair, the CEO of Elysium Corporation, entered the room just to take Ashton's lifeless body and order the surgeons to start working. The surgeons took his body without further ado and took it to the operation room. Months later, there he was, Ash giving a French kiss to an unknown girl in his car, telling her that he would take her home. His skin looked clean, cared for. His body was exactly the same, and his voice, the same pitch, the same tone. They entered Ash's home, and the gas emerged from several holes in the ground. That girl woke up in a different reality from the one we already knew, one in which a boy named Ash was venerated. A statue of that boy who had given her a French kiss in the center of the city of Ataraxia received her with open arms and thousands of tooths on his arms that resembled tentacles. In a nearby church, there he was, Ash's body. They reconstructed it inside of a coffin with the help of an exoskeleton. His virtual body would spend the rest of his days on display, being watched and venerated by the new inhabitants of Turmoil. Well, his real-life body had been reconstructed and cloned thousands of times as an android copies. His real body was placed on the highest level of the Elysium Corporation HQ, as a reminder of what could happen if the experiments aren't well prepared to be on the game. Ashton became an omnipresent being, appearing in various countries, places, and lands. The population of Turmoil grew more and more until he managed to repopulate the place that had been reduced to ashes. One day, one of the clones saw the body preserved in formaldehyde at the very top of the rooftop garden at Elysium Corporation. Was all of this alright? To be displayed at the end after going through a horrific death and suffering. One day, you have heaven in your hands and end up falling into hell. Take care of what you have, because you never know when you lose it until you reach the turmoil.